was to just get a snapshot of what was happening with social media professionals. Are they, do they work on strategy? What is their, we weren't sure where they go. Do they stay in social media for long periods of time, or do they go into other roles within the organization? Is it a stepping stone? So there were a lot of questions that we had that we decided to explore with this research study. And then hopefully we can do a deeper dive into some of the areas that we find in future studies. So to tell you a little bit about the methodology is we put together the survey, and then, well, we first did a very extensive literature review, and then we put together the survey and then pre-tested it with some social media professionals. And then we ended up in our total sample size of getting about 400 people. And then the 450 people, once we had the data, we collected this data earlier in the year when COVID first started to hit. And then I think Marcia and I are proudly one of the last people who probably presented in person at a conference, and that was the Reagan Social Media Conference, and it was in like second week of March. And I think the next, it was at Disney World, the next day they actually shut down Disney World. But we presented to a group of 100 social media professionals, and how we did, I think it was really interesting because how we did that presentation compared to other presentations is we did it as a, this is what we found, what do you think about it? And so we presented all our data, and then it was really interesting talking to them, talking to this group of 100 professionals in a discussion because they were saying like, absolutely, we see these things, we're affected by it, and that helps gives us fodder for our future studies. So I'm going to turn it over to Marcia Destasso, who by the powers of technology has now joined us. So thanks for being here, Marcia. And I already introed and told them about the methodology and the great sponsorship we have. So here we go.
Great. Well, thank you, Tina, and welcome everyone. Really excited about this study. I teach in social media for years, so it's always been interesting to me to think about exactly what this field looks like. And so we're going to start off by talking about kind of what we found in this study about the field of social media managers. So about half of the respondents, well, 65%, said that they spent 50% or less of their job doing social media. So that tells us social media isn't 100% of a lot of people's jobs, right? Some people are doing it on the side, essentially, or in addition to many other things. So around 2/3 were the most senior person in their organization, but only 40% of them managed a team. So I think that's also interesting. And then 64% said they were the senior most social media person in their organization. So it's really important to kind of pause here for a minute and think about what we're dealing with the full gamut of social media managers. We know oftentimes people reflect and think that it's the more junior people, the people right out of college that have been interning, or recent grads that are doing social media. We found that wasn't the case. In fact, only about 1/4 of the survey respondents were under the age of 30. So this is truly a profession that has a variety of people that are working in it, not just recent college grads. Go ahead and flip to the next slide, please. All right, so we did ask, you can't do a social media study and not ask what social media channels people are managing. So we did ask. And remember, this was pre-COVID, so there may be some slight changes here, but I think overall, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube, Pinterest, Snapchat, TikTok. I imagine TikTok might be a little bit higher now, but those were the percentages that they were managing at the time. Please. Okay, so with this one, what we're thinking about here is that most respondents had previous experience in social media. And I think that's important to note. Around 68% had that previous experience before the current position that they're in now. 65% also had experience in marketing, 64% in public relations, and 60% in media relations. So these are people that are coming into the social media position with a variety of background, not just a social media track that got them there. More than 3/4 of respondents, well, 83%, had been managing or involved in the organization's social media account for 7 years or less. It makes sense. Think about the time frame, what's changed in the past 7 years. And then the majority of the respondents did not take a college course in social media. And I think this is also important to consider that many of the respondents have been doing this for a while, and it is more common to have social media courses today than it was previously. I'm proud to say that at UF, we not only teach social media management, but we have social media analytics. We're looking at increasing our social media content in our courses and having more of a focus on that as well. But not all places do that, right? So it's important to really keep this in perspective, the time frame as well as what's offered. And then a limited number of respondents who did take a course that completed this survey said that they took courses in social or digital media marketing, strategy, and management. Those were the more common courses. So flip, please. All right, so thinking about the structure. So the structure of the way the social media teams work was something we were really curious about. And we found that currently about half of the respondents said that social media was in the communications public relations function. Around a third, 38%, said it was in marketing, and only 4% said it was a standalone. So we do see that public relations has a pretty big foothold here in that, but social media can be in other departments as well, and we found that here. Concerning the reporting structure, we found that 40% reported to a senior manager or director, while nearly 1/4 reported to the C-suite. So not everyone's reporting to the top, but there are folks that are reporting right up to that C-suite. And then this is interesting and possibly concerning. About half of the respondents said there were 2 to 3 people on their social media team. Okay, so 31% said they were the sole person responsible for social media. That means the mean size of teams that we looked at was around 5, but there's a good amount of people that are the only person handling social media. And Tina's going to talk about in a few minutes how important and why this is such a big finding in our study. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Tina.
Okay, great. So the next questions we asked were about job roles and performance. We were wondering, well, how involved, are people more tacticians or are they more strategists? So we wanted to find out to what degree that they participated in different levels of strategy within the organization. So we were excited to find out that social media managers are usually always involved in the social media strategy, as you would expect. It's a little concerning that some of them were seldom involved in social media strategy as being responsible for social media. And then, once you sort of go out of the circle, you get fewer people who are involved. But 2/3 of individuals were involved in the department or function strategy, usually or always, which is really great. Where we saw sort of the decline is in the business and organization strategy, because a lot of what we do, we think about how does it relate to the business, how does it tie in, and how does it further the operational or business goals of an organization. And so that finding was that 42% said they usually are always involved. And there may be a gap there, and there's obviously room for improvement because of sort of for a lot of organizations, how critical social media is as a function in an organization, that they should have frequent involvement also within the business and organizational strategy as well. And they typically have a strong pulse on what's happening with both external and internal stakeholders. All right, so we also wanted to ask about how valued they feel in the organization and how well do they think they do in the organization. So we first asked about how they would rate their job performance in their social media role. Overall, more than 3/4 said their job performance was average or above. In fact, 96% of individuals said they were average or above in their job performance. Only a small number said that they were below average or very poor. We also asked about their job satisfaction with their social media role. 59% were either satisfied or very satisfied in their social media role, while less than 14% were dissatisfied. So a small number had some degree of dissatisfaction. And then you have that, 27% that is, they're neither satisfied or dissatisfied. So we also asked about, well, how do you think you rate your perceived value to the organization in terms of your responsibilities? And the good news is that 94% of respondents said that they were average or above. And if you look at the above average and excellent, you have nearly 60% who said that they have above average or excellent value to the organization in terms of their responsibilities. So obviously people perceive this to be, the social media professionals perceive this to be a valued role within the organization. So we also wanted to find out about job performance and how people, how they're evaluated for what they do in social. And so what we found is that the top 3 metrics for job performance are engagement and replies, progress towards goals at 36%, and then 1/3 were follower counts. I think what was pretty surprising to us, though, is that 30%, so nearly 1 in 3, do not have their social media performance evaluated at all. And then the ones that had fewer were revenue, response time, and satisfaction scores. Those were about 1 in 10 of the respondents. And then we also wanted to know, are there any incentives in terms of bonus or money that they receive if they perform well on social media? And there's only a small percentage, so about 1 in 10, that said that they actually receive some sort of bonus for their social media performance. All right, so of course we wanted to know about, okay, well then, social media is compared to maybe some other areas, it's always evolving. There's always new tools, and if it's strategic, you have to think about which tools do we get involved in, how do I know about things, how do I keep up to date, because it is ever-changing technology, and there's all different rules and regulations you have to stay up to date with. So we wanted to know sort of what of the professional activities that people do engage in to improve your social media management. And so the most common ones were webinars and seminars or workshops. And then fewer actually did sort of what I would consider some long-term, like grad school or other programs that they would to improve their social media management through activities. All right, so now, Marcia, I believe I turn it over to you.
And unmute. All right, so with this slide, what we're thinking about is really looking at within the position. Talking about their budget. We were curious to see kind of what people are thinking about with their current budget. 27% said they don't have a budget. And then those that do, most budgets were under 30,000. We also were wondering, remember pre-COVID, what people thought the future looked like for their budgets. And 47% at that time had said they thought it would increase, 50% had said this stayed the same, and only 3% anticipated it decreasing. It would be interesting to see what people anticipate now. Remember this, we didn't know what we now know and don't know, but it is interesting to see that management of a budget and how that plays out in social media as well. Next slide digs in a little bit more. And with this one, we were asking about the authority to purchase the social media tools and services for the department. We're really curious, beyond the budget, do you have a say, or are you kind of your tools dictated? Do you have the flexibility within that and the authority within that? And we found that 58% said that they had the authority to make those purchases. And I think that's really valuable. We did not measure how the 42% have their decisions made about what tools they're using, but that would be interesting to see and consider as well. All right, next slide, please. So with this, we were looking at trying to identify the industries that social media managers are working within. Our gut tells us we have social media managers in every industry, right? But with this study, we asked the people that participated where they were, and around 1/3 were in education and nonprofits. Other top industries included healthcare, pharmaceuticals, biotech, government, financial services. I mean, it truly is the full gamut, but that's the folks that participated in this survey. All right, next slide, please. So we wanted to know, right, the big picture of public relations and how this function works. And so we asked about where or kind of what groups we work with in the current role. And that, of course, runs, we have a top 10 list here. But when thinking about this, the top, really, most people were working with marketing. 76% were also working with marketing. 72% with public relations. Brand building, they identified 68%. Most people are working with them. And media relations was 63% of the folks in this study said that they're working with the folks in media relations. So this indicates that social media isn't truly a silo, that there's some collaboration within these different departments. And I think that's both it makes sense, but it's also a great business strategy as well. All right, Tina, we're back to you.
Okay, so we wanted to see, okay, well, as I said when we introed, well, like, where do you go from here in your career? How do you move up? And I think we learned a lesson when we were doing focus groups in our Women in Leadership study that not everybody wants to be promoted. And that was something that came out of focus groups that we eventually put in the survey. And this is the same sort of feeling. You have, a group of people who are content where they are, they're happy with where they're not necessarily want to move up to the next level. And that was about 23%. But the others, so about 70%, wanted to move to a more senior level role. And our sort of theory was, well, is there space for them to move up in a role, and how does that happen? So from this, we know that social media managers are ambitious. And if you look, even 27% want to be the top leader in their function. So how well does this role prepare for them? So then we wanted to find out about, well, what is the ability of them to be actually advanced into a senior level role? 40% said they saw a likelihood to be promoted, while about, you have more of like the neutral and probably not, above a little 50%, right? So that's concerning in a way, because it could be because they're already in a more senior position, or maybe there's not an outlet for them, or maybe they would like to transition to another role. So there's all sorts of possibilities that we could explore with this further. So then when we asked about, okay, well, we have this information, people want to be promoted. Are they going to stay in their current role? Or are they actively looking what's happening? And do they think that will be a social media role? So more than half of the social media managers at 57% said that they did not anticipate being in their current role for more than 2 years. Even 1/4 said less than a year. And then 22%, so 1 in 5, said they were actively seeking roles. So that's quite a bit of turnover in that area. And then we wanted to see, well, is your next role going to be a social media role? And, it's very low numbers. We have nearly 1/3 who said, yes, I do think it'll be a social media role. And then others were unsure. And then others said no. So, I think our next study is exploring, well, why? What are the reasons why that maybe people don't want to stay in a role? And it could be because they want to move up. It could be also because of the strain of the, position itself. So we also wanted to find out about work-life fit. There's been some great studies like Gilkerson, Anderson, and Swenson. I hope I got all those right. If I missed them, I apologize. They had a great, and Dr. Rita Menn has done some great research on this too, looking at sort of the the work-life fit of social media managers. And Marcia talked about this earlier, is that if you have 31% who are managing their own team, how are they able to manage? Because social media is, it's a 24-hour job that if some crisis happens, that's one of your primary own channels to get information out. So we wanted to see about the work-life fit of these individuals. So most social media managers work slightly more than the standard 40-hour work week. More than half said they work about 41 to 59 hours a week. So when Marcia and Diane and I, we were talking about the survey, we said, well, it's PR. So maybe that's just standard that people work over 40 hours. So then we wanted to find out, okay, well, how much do they work? How much do they perceive to work in relation to other people in their department? And then what we did find out is that nearly half said that they work more than their colleagues. So I think that was one of the findings that we had that sort of will help us in our future studies. And only like 5% said they work less than somebody else. So we did a very quick overview of our study just to run through, because I believe Diane is going to, I know Diane is going to ask us some questions about what the impact means and the so what of this study that we worked on. So Diane?
Great, thanks Tina, thanks Marcia. Such interesting findings. My first question to both of you from all of this, and you touched on it a little, is what was the most interesting finding for each of you from this report? I mean, for me, it's interesting. I mean, this was pre-COVID, but 47% said that they expect to have a larger budget for social media, which I thought was promising. But also the amount of hours a week that they're working is also pretty startling, so those are my key takeaway, key surprising points. But what about for each of you?
Well, for me, I agree with the points that you just mentioned. There were quite a few things that actually surprised me and I found interesting. Even if it didn't surprise me, it was still interesting to see. But I would say the one point that I think was the most surprising was that 30% of respondents don't have their social media performance evaluated. And I think that's a problem in the field, because if we're looking at not evaluating that content, it's possible that we're maybe more tactically driven than strategically driven. And I think that that could be problematic long-term.
Such a good point. It's hard to advocate for yourself and career advancement, right? When you don't have, you're not measured against goals. Tina, what about you?
Yeah, I think there were a couple for me too. One was that just sort of the always on, how hard that social media managers work. But also I think there's a lot of things to explore on the career ladder of a social media professional, right? What is the growth opportunity within? Because if people are looking for jobs or plan to only stay a small period of time, or actively seeking opportunities. I mean, you have this person who's trained, knows a lot about the organization, but is actively seeking opportunities elsewhere. So that is concerning to me, just the turnover, the always on, and, especially with COVID, and I think an increased focus on mental health, I think is something that we need to explore further.
Yeah, for sure. Please, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A section, the bottom of your screen. Sort of piggybacking on that, Tina, why do you think there's such a high turnover? According to the report, people looking, to get out of, possibly to leave their jobs, within like a couple years or a year. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so I don't have, this isn't data-based, but the one is, I think there's a lot of opportunities out there for social media managers, and there's a lot of job opportunities because that's such a critical function, and people want people who run it well. And I think probably my dog's kicking off, so my apologies, but I think also it's the time spent. Even when we talked at the Reagan conference, they just said they love it, but it's also exhausting at the same time. And especially for the solo people, it's just tiring. So I think that's probably lends itself to it as well.
And one of the things that I've been hearing from a lot of students is this is something that they've been doing for years, and then they get a job in it, and quite frankly, some of them just get tired and want to do something different. So I'm hearing a little bit about that as well. And I think it comes back to the idea if we're not measuring it and we're just creating content, then that may also get a little not as enjoyable with time. So the more that we can connect to the business goals and strategy and other elements of the position, I think can hopefully add that additional value.
Can you elaborate that on that a bit more, sort of like metrics and, sort of how a social media manager might want to set themselves up for success with measurable goals? I mean, there's often talk about likes and followers and how that's just really artificial, almost like add value equivalency, to be. So what do you recommend? I know it's different for different companies, but just as a start, to even be thinking about measurable activities.
Well, there's a lot of different things that can be measured, right? I don't want to say that the vanity metrics shouldn't be measured, because I think that of course is part of the toolkit. We can see, did we increase likes? Did we increase followers? I do still see some value there. But, when we go back to the textbook, anytime that we can connect to measuring outcomes and impact of what we're doing, we're going to see the greater value there. And that's challenging and more timely to do, frankly. But when we can, I think that's where we're going to see the added value.
Yeah, and I would just add that, I think it's about sitting down and having, these are the indicators that I'm going to be measured on, or that I should be measured on, that have meaning and value, right? So when you have what I consider more meaningless metrics, right? Because if I'm looking at how much growth we have in social media, and I mean, Nikki, who runs this webinar, is our head of social media. If her goal was to increase follower counts, I mean, I can do that today. We can buy a whole bunch of followers and she would get a great bonus and all this, but that's not what it's about. It's how well do you tie into behaviors, right? And there's a lot of better ways that you can measure behavior on social media. How people click, where do they go? How do you survey their attitudes, awareness, and behaviors that I think are the better metrics that should be used instead of some of the others. And I mean, geez, I just can't even imagine people not being measured at all. But it's not surprising. I mean, even in some of our other studies where we asked, how are you measuring or how are you soliciting feedback from employees? You always have that quarter to 30% who are like, we're not. So it's not surprising, but I think that 30% needs to step it up.
Yeah, so true. Some of the questions coming in have to do with where social media reports into, and so, broadly, your viewpoint on who owns social media, who's in the driver's seat. Maybe it's, two people in the driver's seat, maybe it's marketing and PR, is that possible? But sort of what's your viewpoint? This is coming more from a PR communications bent, I know, but what's your view on where social media should sit within an organization? Tina? And then Marcia.
So I can argue with myself about this, where we only had a small percentage who said it was a standalone function, and one of the reasons why I can see why that may be beneficial is because it does impact a lot of components of a company, whether it's HR, operations, I mean, all these different areas that it has impact. But I mean, I'm biased. I definitely think it should be within a comms function, because comms is that the spoke of a wheel where all the different components and managing what the channels are of the organization. So I definitely think it should be within comms, as we saw with half of the people, because it doesn't just touch products and placement. It touches HR and internal comms and all sorts of other areas that comms should be responsible for.
I agree. You figure public relations, our big role is as an integrator across an enterprise, right? And so there's probably no better person or better team within an organization that has their foot in so many places to understand those different needs of the different departments and be able to integrate all of that. So that makes sense. But I also think, you know, I sit in a college of journalism and communications and teach in a public relations program. And I see the difference in approach to how social media is addressed at the college level, right? In advertising, typically they connect to paid content. They're going to do that far better than we do in public relations, but that's going to be their first approach to that. So a grounding and understanding and marketing and advertising, if that's your first thought, that could be a concern possibly, or not, depending on you know, the approach of the social media. Versus journalism in my college, they're great at content creation, but knowing the strategy behind why we do what we do and how we do it, that's where we, I think, in public relations excel, and being able to connect all of that. I think we could do better at understanding paid, earned, owned, right? The whole picture. We could also do better at content creation, possibly. So that's why it's so nice to see that the average team was 5 people. In theory, a team of 5 can have different experts in those different areas of social media, but not everyone has the ability to have a deep expertise in. Versus when it's a single person running, you're going to go from the perspective that you know best and are most comfortable with, and that may or may not be a long-term strategy that benefits the organization.
Thank you. So for the students out there watching this and listening in, what would you say, well, a double question here, the skills that they need to go into a career in social media, and perhaps some of the courses, less obvious courses maybe, that they should be thinking about taking at, you know, the college level or even beyond, you know, that would be really helpful for them in this environment. Marcia, and then Tina.
Again, I think I'm biased, right? Because I am in public relations and we've got such a strong program at UF. With our program, we focus on public relations. So you can get a degree in public relations, and we teach our students to look at the big picture, how to understand strategy, how to be a good writer, how to be a good researcher. And I think those key critical elements there are necessary no matter where you are, what your role is in public relations. But I think it applies to social media as well, right? That whole big picture of strategy, research, and writing is so very valuable. I would add to that, knowing social media analytics. We have the perception that anyone can do social media. I have a 12-year-old daughter that would tell you she's great at social media, but frankly, she's not, right? And so are a lot of our students. They think they know it because they use it, but understanding the strategy behind how to use it, why to use it, how to connect with the audience, and how to identify who the audience is, and whether or not you're meeting their needs, that takes training. And understanding all of the different analytical tools to be able to do that well and quickly also takes training. And so I would say, you know, data insights, deriving insight from that data. We're in a big data world with social media. How do you know what to interpret and what to pay attention to? That takes experience, but it also, that experience being fueled with training is really the best combination, I think.
I'm not going to say anything about the courses because that's really Marcia's expertise. But just to add to what she said is, you know, people do have this perception that anyone can do social media and it's really easy. And even from my experience, it's not easy. And in addition to the training and everything that Marcia said, you need someone who can also think about how this relates to the business, how does this promote what we're doing? And what's a way, I mean, you can write like a social media post 10 different ways. Half of them may be great, half of them may be just awful. And you could see it in engagement, and you have to know how people think. You have to like incorporate psychology, behavioral science, and that sort of big picture. So you're not just producing content to produce content, which I consider to be content pollution, and I think is a huge factor for a lot of organizations. And it's also hard to engage with people. Like, how do you engage with a supporter without with giving them the information they need and making sure you show appreciation? I mean, there's all sorts of different considerations you have to think about, which is why I think we were really happy with the study that it wasn't considered, even though people have this perception that, oh, social media, there's all some social media issue. They're like, that's why it's, you don't give it to an intern, it's something else, which I think is a big assumption. I mean, there's a lot of people who are well trained in social media, but I think it's complicated. So I think that's important to know as well.
Yeah, there might even be like an image problem, right? With this area, you point to your daughter and everybody thinks they know social media, but it also goes back to measurable, outcomes and things like that, and advocating internally. I'm going to read one of the questions that came in. With the complexity of 2020, this person is sharing, she's incredibly conscious about the speed of issues blowing up with respect to diversity, COVID, etc. My team is incredibly focused on risk mitigation and responding to issues right now as I lead the social media team. One of the biggest challenges we're facing is burnout. Are you planning to do any further research about this current environment and what it could mean over the short to medium term? The health and wellness of my team is a significant concern. So this is someone on a social media team. Tina?
Yeah, it's I can speak to this and then turn it over to Marcia. So we just IPR just launched a Center for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and one of the areas that we're focused on is mental health. There is not enough research. There's been some great research out of Canada, CIPR, but there's been like a lack of research about mental health and burnout in our field. And I think it's a significant issue. And especially for social media managers, when you're a team of one and you don't necessarily have people who are there to help you, right? I mean, even when we were talking to people in the presentation, they were like, oh, well, when I eat dinner and then I get on, and then I'm looking at my social and I'm managing social, and having that additional component is really important. We are IPR. I don't know how much it's going to be necessarily related to social, but we're going to do a industry-wide survey looking at mental health, burnout, stress, what areas are really stressful, because especially with COVID, it's problematic. And as speaking to the risk averse, this is a challenge for a lot of companies, right? Like, how do we put ourselves out there? What do we say on social? And if we say something on social, how fast do we have to act? If you act too slow, then you'll get crushed on social. But then if you say something and you don't follow through with action, then you can also get crushed in the same way. So that's why that social media person is so critical to being part of the strategy. Because as good communicators know, this isn't going to go away. It's not that we're going to continue to be more risk averse. It's that the trend is going to be that we are going to be more open, talk about social issues, and have to make a stand increasingly on these issues. So it's having that good, being a good counselor and integrator, as Marcia said.
I don't know how to add to that too much, other than I think that this is a problem that's not specific to social media. It may be made more extreme for social media folks, but we're seeing burnout with students. I spend a lot of time thinking about how life right now, the constantly being on is influencing everything for my students and my faculty, and frankly myself. I mean, all of us are in a very different environment than we were previously. One of the things that a student said to me recently is she often spends all day on Zoom in class, sitting 9 hours sitting on Zoom, and what downtime does she have? they get off, they get back on and study, and there's so much computer time that we need to be forcing ourselves to take time off, take time to step away. And there may be ways to incorporate that into the function as well. Hopefully it's not an individual running a sole team, because that's challenging and struggling. But there's got to be a support system that we build into all of everything that we're doing now, and trying to figure out how to get through that burnout, because it's not to anyone's advantage, right? This long-term success can't continue at that fast pace.
Yeah, and just to add to what Marcia said, Marcia and I, when we talked about this, you have to have nights off for the social media manager if you're the sole person. Mm-hmm. So we suggested you should have a minimum of 2 people involved in some way in social. That way, if somebody's sick, they go on vacation, that they are on vacation. And it's having senior leaders who model that behavior as well. But so if you have 2 people in charge, that, if you are the sole person and you're responsible, and you check it before you go to bed and you're doing things, and you wake up and grab that phone and check it again, that you have somebody who's on call at least two evenings a week. That way you can enjoy and have that off time and put the phone down. And also, like, turning off notifications, that if if there's someone else in charge of social for that time, if you have multiple people, that you sort of divvy up the work, but also turning off the notifications on your phone. And I'm guilty. I do not turn off the notifications on my phone, but I think as far as my mental health, I would probably be much better when I put the phone down, which I try to some on the weekends, and it really helps me recharge. So I'm great at giving advice, and I'm terrible at taking my own advice. So there you go.
Self-discipline.
I would just like to add to that. I remember a few years ago, someone was saying that they leave the office loudly. And it's the idea of modeling behavior, right? So if we are running a team, saying, this is what I'm doing, I'm taking tonight off, we need to leave our function loudly so others know it's okay, especially when we have more junior members. Those junior members are so eager and so gung-ho, and they take it so personally that they don't want the perception that they're not working as hard as everyone else, right? We all get into that. And if we don't understand that someone else is, our boss and our colleagues are taking time off, then we're going to be less likely to take that time off. So I think we need to practice self-care loudly. Maybe didn't sound appropriate, but ultimately,
yeah.
Right? We need to share what we're doing. We're all in this together, and we need to be able to support each other in doing that.
Right, and quality could go down, right, when you're working so many hours. What do you think would be different if we were to have done the survey like a month or 2 ago, and during the pandemic? Do you think there'd be any material changes? A couple of people were asking that question.
I don't. I think in the future, and we're to have another study coming out looking at that people are going to have lower budgets and less staff probably in the next couple of years. I think that would be something that would be different now. And I think the burnout, the hours that people work are greater. I do think, even if people are like, oh, it's more Zoom, and while that, people may not have the commutes or that they used to, I do think this has been a really busy time for a lot of companies where they've been busier than ever. So I think those would probably be differences, but and maybe increase value to the organization, but I think probably a lot of it would
and maybe they're not going to be leaving their jobs as quickly.
Yeah, that too. Yeah.
Yeah. What about you, Marcia?
I think Tina's right. I agree with all of that. I also think that while there might not be an increased emphasis in measurement, there's probably more focus on content for different stakeholders. Right? We know during COVID, there's been a higher emphasis placed on communicating for employees. And so being more mindful of the content that's going out over social media and the influence of employees and kind of what's happening at the company versus product. is probably something that we would see, which then comes back to social media managers working in their home, trying to connect with others. So it's harder, it's more challenging, but I do think we would see that as a result of some of that, more hours being worked, shorter, less members of the team working on that. So I think we would notice that. Also decrease in budgets.
Mm-hmm. There were some questions about follow-up research and those in research and academia. Like, what would you like to see out there, whether it's from IPR or others, in terms of taking this data and digging into certain areas of it? Is there some recommendations on further research others could be doing in this space?
Well, I love IPR research. I mean, we're the best read. No, I'm kidding. I definitely think that, I think there's different within here, and that may even be something of doing focus groups to talk to groups of managers. When Marcia and I presented in Orlando, that was such a great conversation because people talked about, the burden of being the one person and actually thinking about ways that could be more call to action and help. That be a little more manageable. I think diving into just some of these core areas, the work-life fit, what sort of strategic, are they doing in terms of strategy? Marcia's my guiding post when it comes to what we're going to do with the next research project. So she would probably be, I'll just wait for her. She'll give us her wisdom and then I just do whatever she suggests. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Tina. Well, I think we got into this to better understand the social media ladder, right? Diane, we had these conversations about what is the ladder? And I think we got closer to understanding both the social media function and what that ladder looks like. But there's still a lot to that ladder that we don't understand. So I think that the next research needs to build from this study and better understand kind of where those next steps are. Where do people want to go? What do they see as their star that they're aiming for? And then look at the integration of the function across an enterprise and see. We know that they're working with other departments, but what we didn't measure is how they're working with the other departments. So there's a lot of insight into current roles as well that we can continue to dig into. We had to be very mindful with this study. Actually, it's a very long study. We're lucky we got as many respondents as we did because it was meaty. You can't ask someone to spend an hour on a survey, and we had well over an hour's worth of questions, so we had to whittle down to this first survey, and then we'll build from there. But I think this is something that as we look, there's so many positions in social media, and trying to figure out the role of those positions, if that's changing, and then what the skills are that people need to come to the table with, what that baseline of expectation is. I think we can do some additional research into that as well. So there's no shortage for research topics. In other words, academics that are on here, let's do it. There's plenty of research that could go into this, both on the function side as well as on just how organizations can better communicate, right? Social media is a tool in the toolbox. It's not the only tool. So we need to think about how all of that integrates as well.
For sure. What about some of the social media platforms? Are there any you want to point out that maybe has the most potential from a communication standpoint? I would say, I'd preface that with it really depends on the brand, right, and their audience and where they're at. But do you want to comment at all on any of the platforms we saw in the research? The report, which platforms were the most prominent, and TikTok probably would be higher today if we were surveying. But any comments on the platforms and advice to those watching this?
Yeah, I have a bone to pick with some of the platforms. I think for companies and brands that I think companies and brands overall, they're still going to stick with where their audience is. The Facebook, Twitter, which to me is more customer service outlet, just because of the function of it. LinkedIn, I know LinkedIn's growing, not only here, but in Asia, because a lot of places in China, you don't have access to the platforms. I mean, there's workarounds. But, you know, I think one of the challenges, if we think about strategically for these platforms, is how they're managing information. And, you know, Diane, we talked about disinformation on these platforms, and I think it's really problematic. You know, we just saw last week with the Hunter Biden story that you had like 3 platforms, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, had drastically different approaches to how they're handling disinformation. And I think for companies, that creates significant issues. So I think some of the dark side of some of these social media platforms will be the bigger challenge for these companies. And that's something I would love to explore more in terms of the research that really isn't out there. We're all very pro social media, but there's a lot of problems with the social media platforms as they are today with their policies.
Let's do some research on that.
Man, I'm telling you, I'm just the stuff, and like, you know, it's Section 230 that they are not held responsible for the disinformation that they spread. And like, how do you manage that as a brand? And not only that, you have a lot of advertising and the information that they're using and taking from people. And so it's this huge I see it as a conflict with, here's my strategies and organization, here's what we support. And then you have the social media platforms that aren't adopting the same sort of values that many companies have.
Yeah.
Get off my soapbox and rant about SM platforms.
We have about a minute left. Marcia, you want to comment on the platforms?
I agree with what Tina said. I think that disinformation is a huge issue. I see with students, they aren't using a lot of the social media tools. It's hard to learn how to manage it if you don't know how to use it yourself. So plug for that. But we'll leave it at that.
Okay, so thank you both so much for your insightful comments and offering up, you know, more clarity around the report. And just to close out, what would you say what hashtag would you give for 2020, this wonderful year we've had as a world, as a planet? Hashtag what?
Yeah, hashtag. I'm not going to tell a long story, but this is dedicated to Nikki Caceres because she's the one who taught me this. It is the WOTE, the worst of all time. That's my hashtag.
That's a good one.
I don't know. I came up with a ton. Like all of a sudden I'm thinking, maybe hashtag I need a minute. Just, I need a minute to breathe.
Right. Hashtag is, are we done yet? Right. Well, thank you so much. Should we leave loudly? Yeah.
Very loud. Nikki,
Yes.
Nikki's going to conclude us loudly.
Nikki, on to you.
Yes, Tina, that was a fantastic hashtag. Marsha's hashtag was great too. That was really sum it up. So this marks the end of the webinar. Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Dr. Destasso, and thank you, Dr. McCorkindale, for presenting. And thank you to all of you for attending our webinar today. The playback will be made available in the next couple days on the IPR website. You can also download the full report on our website under IPR Signature Studies. Thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic day.